Behind the closed doors of kingdom halls across the world, there exists a reality that few outsiders ever witness. It's a reality governed by unwritten codes, whispered guidelines, and expectations that shape the most intimate aspects of human life. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something that has remained largely hidden from public view, something that affects thousands of married couples and dating individuals within the Jehovah's Witnesses community. These are the secret sexual rules that the organization prefers to keep quiet, regulations that go far beyond what most people imagine when they think of religious guidance on intimacy and marriage. When we think about religious organizations and their teachings on sexuality, we typically imagine general moral guidelines, perhaps some advice about waiting until marriage, maybe discussions about fidelity and commitment. What we're about to explore goes far deeper than that. We're talking about specific, detailed regulations on what married couples can and cannot do in their own bedrooms, rules that are rarely published in official literature but are nevertheless enforced with surprising vigor. We're discussing a system where the most private moments between husband and wife can become matters of congregational concern, where elders may question couples about their intimate practices, and where deviation from these unspoken rules can lead to devastating consequences including public shaming, formal reproval, or even complete expulsion from the community and separation from one's entire family network. The journey into understanding these hidden rules begins with the concept of dating within the Jehovah's Witnesses community. Unlike in mainstream society where dating is often seen as a casual way to get to know different people, to explore compatibility, to have fun and build memories, dating among Jehovah's Witnesses carries an entirely different weight. From the very first moment two people express interest in each other, the relationship is viewed through the lens of potential marriage. There is no concept of casual dating, no idea of going out just to see if you might enjoy someone's company. When a young Jehovah's Witness begins courting someone, it is understood by everyone in the congregation that this is a serious undertaking with marriage as the clear and immediate goal. This fundamental difference in approach shapes every interaction between the couple. They are expected to maintain what the organization calls Christian conduct at all times, which translates into strict limitations on physical contact. Hand-holding might be acceptable in public settings, but even prolonged embraces can raise eyebrows. Kissing, especially anything beyond brief pecks, is generally discouraged before engagement, and many couples report feeling pressured to limit even that until their wedding day. The underlying philosophy is that physical affection naturally leads to sexual desire, and sexual desire outside of marriage is considered a grave sin. Therefore, the solution promoted by the organization is to minimize all physical contact until the marriage vows have been exchanged. But here's where things get particularly interesting and where the hidden rules really begin to emerge. Young couples are often told that they should never be alone together without supervision. This isn't just a suggestion, it's a firm expectation communicated by parents, by elders, and by the peer pressure of other young members who are watching and reporting on each other's behavior. Dating couples are encouraged to spend time together only in group settings or with chaperones present. The reasoning given is that being alone creates opportunities for temptation, and the organization takes a dim view of trusting young people to maintain self-control in private settings. Many former members describe the extreme measures taken to ensure couples were never alone. Some recall having to keep doors open when visiting each other's homes, even if parents were present in other rooms. Others remember being advised not to sit too close together during group gatherings, not to dance together in ways that involved too much body contact, and certainly not to engage in activities like watching movies alone in darkened rooms. The level of surveillance and the expectation that members would report on each other's behavior created an atmosphere where romance was simultaneously encouraged as a path to marriage but also viewed with deep suspicion and anxiety. These restrictions don't simply evaporate once a couple gets engaged. The engagement period, which is often kept deliberately short to minimize the time of temptation, continues to be governed by strict rules about physical contact. Engaged couples report being counseled to avoid situations where they might be tempted to go beyond the approved boundaries. Some congregations specifically advise against engagement periods longer than 6 months, with the explicit reasoning that it becomes increasingly difficult for couples to maintain purity the longer they have to wait for their wedding night. The wedding itself is another area governed by specific, though often unwritten, expectations. Jehovah's Witnesses weddings are typically simple affairs, and there are guidelines about what kind of music is appropriate, what kind of dancing is acceptable, and how the celebration should be conducted. But beyond the ceremony and reception, there's anticipation and anxiety about what comes next. Because for many Jehovah's Witnesses, their wedding night represents not just a celebration of love but the first time they're permitted to express physical affection without fear of judgment or punishment. And this is where the hidden rules become even more significant and potentially more damaging. You might think that once two people are married, they would be free to express their love for each other in whatever way they choose, behind closed doors, in the privacy of their own home. This assumption would be profoundly mistaken when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses. The organization has a long and documented history of attempting to regulate not just whether married couples have sex, but how they have sex. We're not talking about general guidance on respect and mutual consent, which would be reasonable. We're talking about specific prohibitions on particular sexual acts between married partners. For decades, Jehovah's Witnesses literature and elder instructions explicitly condemned oral and anal sex between married couples, categorizing these acts as unnatural and porneia, which is the Greek term for sexual immorality. This wasn't a private matter of conscience left to individual couples. This was organizational policy that was enforced through the Judicial Committee system. If elders learned that a married couple was engaging in these practices, the couple could be brought before a judicial committee, questioned in detail about their intimate activities, and if they didn't express sufficient repentance and commitment to change their behavior, they could be disfellowshipped, which means being completely shunned by every Jehovah's Witness they know, including their own family members. Think about the implications of this for a moment. Picture a married couple who believe they are serving God faithfully, who attend every meeting, who go door-to-door preaching, who try to live according to their understanding of biblical principles. Then imagine that in their private intimate moments, they engage in an act that the organization deems unacceptable. Perhaps they're not even aware that this specific act is forbidden. Perhaps they discover it brings them closer together, helps them connect emotionally and physically. Now imagine that somehow the elders find out. Maybe one partner feels guilty and confesses. Maybe someone overhears a private conversation. Maybe a medical issue leads to questions. What happens next is a process that many former members describe as deeply traumatic. The couple, or sometimes just the individual who confessed, is called to meet with a judicial committee, typically consisting of 3 male elders. These men, who may be janitors, window washers, or retired factory workers in their secular lives, will proceed to ask detailed, explicit questions about exactly what sexual acts occurred, how frequently, in what positions, who initiated them, whether both partners enjoyed them, and whether they plan to continue. The level of detail demanded in these interrogations is shocking to many who experience it. Some former members report being asked to describe their intimate encounters in graphic detail, to specify whether there was penetration, whether there was oral to genital contact, exactly what happened and in what sequence. The stated purpose of this interrogation is to determine whether the individual is truly repentant and whether they can be spiritually restored. But the process itself often feels more like punishment than pastoral care. Many report feeling humiliated, violated, and traumatized by having to discuss their most private moments with men who are often relative strangers, men who hold tremendous power over their continued membership in the only community they've ever known. The psychological impact of this scrutiny cannot be overstated. People who have gone through this process describe feeling dirty, ashamed, and confused about their own sexuality for years afterward. Some develop serious intimacy issues in their marriages because the association between sexual expression and punishment becomes so deeply embedded. The enforcement of these rules has varied over time and by location. In some congregations, elders took a particularly aggressive approach, actively seeking out information about couples' sexual practices. In others, the rules were enforced only when someone voluntarily confessed or when information came to light through other means. But the very existence of these rules, the knowledge that one's most intimate moments could potentially become the subject of a judicial hearing, created an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship in thousands of bedrooms around the world. It's worth examining the supposed biblical basis for these restrictions. The organization pointed to passages condemning unnatural sexual relations, but biblical scholars, including many within Christianity, note that these passages were historically understood to refer to practices like temple prostitution, adultery, or homosexual acts, not to consensual activities between married heterosexual couples. The extension of these prohibitions to include oral sex between married partners was never a mainstream Christian interpretation. It was specific to Jehovah's Witnesses and a few other extremely conservative religious groups. This raises an important question about where these rules really came from and what purpose they served. Some former elders and high-ranking members who have left the organization suggest that these detailed sexual regulations served primarily as a mechanism of control. By extending the organization's authority into the most intimate aspects of members' lives, The leadership reinforced the message that nothing was beyond their purview, that total obedience was required in every sphere of existence. If the organization could tell you what you could and couldn't do with your own spouse in your own bedroom, then clearly there was no aspect of your life that wasn't subject to their authority. This level of control is characteristic of what experts in cult behavior call high-control groups, organizations that seek to regulate not just belief and public behavior but the entirety of members' lives. The way these rules were communicated is also revealing. You won't find detailed discussions of prohibited sexual acts in the glossy magazines that Jehovah's Witnesses leave at people's doors. You won't find explicit lists in the books they study in their public meetings. Instead, this information was transmitted through internal publications meant only for elders, through verbal instructions at elder schools, and through the whisper network of the congregation. This secrecy served multiple purposes. It allowed the organization to maintain a wholesome public image while enforcing strict regulations internally. It also meant that many young Jehovah's Witnesses entered marriage completely unaware of these rules, only discovering them later, sometimes after they had already engaged in practices that could get them disfellowshipped. The psychological impact on sexuality within the Jehovah's Witnesses community has been profound and lasting. When you're taught from childhood that sexual thoughts and feelings are dangerous, that masturbation is a serious sin, that any physical affection before marriage is forbidden, and that even within marriage there are specific rules about what's acceptable, it creates deep-seated anxiety and shame around sexuality. Many former members report taking years or even decades to develop healthy attitudes towards sex after leaving the organization. Some struggle with intimacy in new relationships because the association between sexual expression and guilt is so deeply ingrained. Others describe never being able to fully relax and enjoy sexual intimacy with their spouse because they're always worried about whether what they're doing might be wrong, even after they've left the organization. The situation for women within this system deserves particular attention. In a religious organization where men hold all official authority, where women cannot be elders or hold positions of congregational leadership, the power dynamics around these sexual regulations become especially troubling. A woman whose husband wants to engage in sexual practices that she's uncomfortable with may feel she has no recourse, especially if the organization has taught her that wives should be submissive to their husbands. Conversely, a woman who has sexual needs or desires that her husband considers inappropriate may be made to feel that something is wrong with her, that she's not sufficiently modest or pure. The male elders who conduct judicial hearings about sexual matters may have limited understanding of female sexuality, yet they're making judgments about what women should or shouldn't do with their own bodies. There are documented cases of women being questioned by judicial committees about whether they enjoyed certain sexual acts, with the implication being that enjoyment of anything deemed unnatural was itself evidence of spiritual weakness. Think about what this means in practical terms. A woman sits before three men, often much older than her, who ask her intimate questions about her sex life, about what she does with her husband, about whether she experiences pleasure, about whether she has orgasms and how. The invasiveness and the power imbalance in these situations is staggering, yet this was standard practice in many congregations. It's also important to understand that these rules existed alongside a broader context of sexual repression within the organization. Masturbation was considered a serious sin requiring confession and potential reproof. Pornography was strictly forbidden and could result in loss of privileges or disfellowshipping depending on the circumstances. Even romantic movies or novels that contained sexual content were discouraged. The message was clear: any form of sexual expression outside of very narrowly defined marital relations was unacceptable. This created what some psychologists call a purity culture, where shame around sexuality became deeply embedded in members' identities. Young people growing up in this environment often reported intense internal conflicts. They experienced normal sexual development, normal curiosity, normal desires, but they'd been taught that these feelings were shameful, that acting on them in any way was sinful, and that they needed to suppress and control these urges until marriage. Then, suddenly, on their wedding night, they were expected to flip a switch and become comfortable with sexual intimacy. It's not surprising that many Jehovah's Witnesses couples struggled with sexual dysfunction, with mismatched libidos, with inability to communicate about sex, and with general dissatisfaction in their intimate lives. They'd been given no tools to develop healthy sexuality, no permission to explore what they liked or wanted, no framework for understanding sexual compatibility or communication. In the early 2000s, something interesting happened. The organization began to quietly soften its stance on some of these issues. Without making any official announcements or publishing any retractions of previous doctrine, New internal guidance suggested that what happened between married couples in their bedroom was largely a matter of personal conscience, as long as both partners consented and as long as it didn't involve anyone outside the marriage. This represented a significant shift from the explicit prohibitions that had existed for decades. Suddenly, acts that could have gotten someone disfellowshipped in the 1980s or 1990s were being described as personal decisions. But here's the problem with this quiet reversal. The organization never officially apologized for the harm caused by the previous policies. They never acknowledged that thousands of people had been disciplined, shamed, or expelled for engaging in behavior that was now being described as a matter of conscience. They never addressed the trauma experienced by couples who had been interrogated about their sex lives. They simply changed the policy and moved forward as if the previous stance had never existed. This pattern of quietly reversing controversial policies without acknowledgement or apology is characteristic of how the organization operates. It allows them to adapt to changing social norms and avoid criticism while maintaining the claim that they are directed by divine guidance. For many former members, this reversal was particularly painful. They had sacrificed their sexual autonomy, allowed themselves to be interrogated and humiliated, accepted punishment and shame, all because they believed the organization spoke for God. Then, years later, they learned that those same acts were now considered acceptable, that they had suffered for nothing, that the rules that had caused them so much pain had been arbitrary all along. The organization's refusal to acknowledge this harm compounds the injury. It sends the message that individual members' suffering doesn't matter, that the organization's authority is more important than the well-being of the people within it. Even with the policy changes, significant issues remain. The culture of shame and secrecy around sexuality persists in many congregations. Young people are still taught that sexual thoughts and feelings before marriage are dangerous. Masturbation is still considered sinful. Couples still lack healthy frameworks for discussing sexual compatibility before marriage or for navigating sexual issues within marriage. And the fear remains that if you confess the wrong thing to the wrong elder, you might still face consequences, because the application of policies is inconsistent and dependent on individual elders' interpretations. Moreover, the fundamental issue of elder involvement in marital intimacy hasn't been completely resolved. While the organization may now say that specific sexual acts between married couples are a matter of conscience, elders still sometimes become involved in marital disputes that include sexual components. If a wife complains that her husband is demanding sexual acts she's uncomfortable with, or if a husband claims his wife is refusing to fulfill her marital due, elders may feel obligated to intervene, to counsel the couple, to make judgments about whose position is more reasonable. This continued involvement, even if it's framed as pastoral care rather than judicial action, maintains the dynamic where the most private aspects of marriage remain potentially subject to congregational oversight. The stories that emerge from former members paint a picture of deep pain and lasting impact. One woman described how she was brought before a judicial committee after she confessed to her husband that she had engaged in oral sex in a previous relationship before she became a Jehovah's Witness. Even though this had happened before her baptism, even though it had nothing to do with her current marriage, she was reproved and had to face the congregation's judgment. Another man described how his marriage fell apart after his wife confessed their sexual practices to an elder she trusted. He never understood why she felt the need to confess something that he thought was private between them. The subsequent judicial hearing, the public reproof, the shame they experienced in their congregation, all of it destroyed the intimacy and trust in their marriage. They divorced within a year. There are accounts of young newlyweds who spent their wedding night crying because they were so anxious and confused about what was allowed and what wasn't. There are stories of couples who went decades with unsatisfying sexual relationships because they were too afraid to explore or communicate about what they wanted. There are testimonies from people who developed serious mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and complex trauma, directly related to the sexual shame and control they experienced as Jehovah's Witnesses. What makes these rules particularly insidious is how they're justified. The organization presents them as loving guidance designed to protect members' spirituality and maintain their relationship with God. Elders who interrogate couples about their sex lives genuinely believe they're helping people stay on the path to salvation. Members who confess their intimate activities truly think they're doing the right thing by being honest about their sins. The entire system operates under the banner of spiritual care, which makes it difficult for people within it to recognize the harm being done. When you believe that disobedience will result in eternal destruction, when you're convinced that the organization speaks for God, you'll accept treatment and invasions of privacy that you would never tolerate in any other context. This dynamic is compounded by the isolation that Jehovah's Witnesses experience. Members are discouraged from forming close relationships with non-witnesses. They're warned that worldly people will lead them astray, that mainstream psychology and therapy are tools of Satan, that any criticism of the organization comes from apostates who are controlled by demonic influence. This means that when someone experiences harm within the organization, they have nowhere to turn. They can't seek outside counseling without risking being viewed as spiritually weak. They can't discuss their doubts or concerns with non-witness friends or family. They're trapped in a closed system where the only people they can talk to are the same people enforcing the rules that are harming them. The internet and social media have begun to change this dynamic somewhat. Former members now have platforms to share their experiences, to compare notes, to realize that what they experienced wasn't unique or justified. Websites and forums dedicated to supporting former Jehovah's Witnesses are full of discussions about the sexual control and shame experienced within the organization. These conversations are helping people realize that their struggles with intimacy, their feelings of shame around sexuality, their confusion about what healthy sexual expression looks like, all of these are normal responses to abnormal treatment. They're not spiritually weak or damaged beyond repair. They're recovering from a system that deliberately instilled shame and fear around one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Yet the organization continues to operate much as it always has. While some policies have quietly changed, the fundamental structure remains the same. Elders still have tremendous power over members' lives. Judicial committees still interrogate people about their private behavior. The threat of disfellowshipping and shunning still hangs over anyone who steps out of line. And the culture of secrecy persists, with the most controversial policies and practices kept hidden from public view, discussed only in internal meetings and publications that outsiders rarely see. This brings us to the crucial question of why this matters, why we should care about what happens behind the closed doors of a relatively small religious organization. The answer is multifaceted. First, there are the hundreds of thousands of people currently living under these rules, people whose sexual autonomy and psychological well-being are being compromised by an organization that claims divine authority. They deserve to have their experiences acknowledged and validated. Second, there are the countless former members who carry trauma from their time in the organization, who need to understand that what happened to them wasn't okay, that they have every right to be angry about the invasions of privacy and the shame they were made to feel. Third, there's the broader principle at stake about religious organizations' authority and accountability. When any organization claims to speak for God, when it demands absolute obedience from its members, when it punishes those who question or deviate, and when it operates in secrecy without transparency or accountability, warning bells should sound. These are the characteristics of dangerous groups, groups that can cause serious harm to vulnerable people. The sexual rules of Jehovah's Witnesses are emblematic of a larger pattern of control and manipulation. The same organization that tells you what you can do in your bedroom also tells you what you can read, what you can watch, who you can associate with, what career you can pursue, whether you can attend university, whether you can vote or celebrate holidays, whether you can receive certain medical treatments, and whether you can maintain relationships with family members who leave the organization. The sexual control isn't an aberration. It's part of a comprehensive system designed to regulate every aspect of members' lives. Understanding these hidden rules also helps us recognize similar patterns in other high-control religious groups. While the specific regulations may vary, the basic dynamic of using shame and fear around sexuality as a control mechanism appears in many fundamentalist communities. Whether it's purity balls in evangelical Christianity, prohibitions on birth control in certain Catholic communities, or rigid modesty requirements in various conservative religious groups, the underlying principle is the same. Control sexuality and you control the person. Make people ashamed of their bodies and desires and they'll be more compliant, more willing to accept authority, less likely to trust their own judgment or pursue their own path. As we near the end of this investigation, it's important to acknowledge the complexity of these situations. Many Jehovah's Witnesses are sincere people who genuinely believe they're serving God and following the best path for themselves and their families. Many elders who enforce these rules believe they're protecting their congregations from spiritual harm. The organization itself likely believes that its regulations are necessary for maintaining moral standards in an immoral world. Recognizing the sincerity of these beliefs doesn't excuse the harm caused, but it helps us understand why these systems persist and why they're so difficult to change from within. The courage required to question and ultimately leave a high-control group like Jehovah's Witnesses cannot be overstated. When your entire social network, your family relationships, your worldview, your understanding of morality and purpose, when all of this is tied to the organization, walking away means losing everything familiar and starting over from scratch. Many who leave describe it as a kind of death, a death of their former identity and community. They have to rebuild their entire lives, often while dealing with the trauma of what they experienced and the grief of losing contact with people they love who remain in the organization. For those still inside who are beginning to have doubts, who are starting to question whether the sexual rules and other regulations are truly from God, the path forward is difficult. They may feel guilty for even having these questions. They may fear that doubt itself is a sin, a sign of spiritual weakness, an opening for demonic influence. They may worry about what will happen to their marriages, their children, their relationships if they voice their concerns. This is why information like what we've discussed today is so important. People need to know that their questions are valid, that their doubts are reasonable, that what they're experiencing has happened to thousands of others, and that there is life and hope beyond the organization if they choose to leave. The secret sexual rules of Jehovah's Witnesses matter because human sexuality matters. How we understand our bodies, our desires, our capacity for intimacy and pleasure, these things fundamentally shape our sense of self and our ability to form healthy relationships. When an organization deliberately instills shame around sexuality, when it invades the privacy of married couples, when it demands detailed confessions about intimate acts, when it threatens punishment and ostracism for natural human behavior, it causes profound and lasting harm. This harm ripples out through generations as parents pass sexual shame and dysfunction to their children, as unhealthy relationship patterns perpetuate themselves, as people spend decades struggling with intimacy issues that trace back to religious teachings they may no longer even believe. What we've uncovered today is a system that operates in secrecy, that changes its rules without acknowledgement or apology, that claims divine authority while exercising very human control, and that prioritizes organizational unity and authority over individual well-being and autonomy. These are the secret rules that Jehovah's Witnesses don't want you to know about, not because they're deeply spiritual or biblically mandated, but because exposure reveals them for what they are, tools of control that have caused immense suffering for thousands of sincere people who trusted an organization that claimed to speak for God. The silence around these rules is beginning to break as more former members find their voices and share their stories. The question now is whether the organization will finally acknowledge the harm it has caused and make meaningful changes, or whether it will continue to operate in secrecy, maintaining control through shame and fear while presenting a wholesome public face to the world.